Hello and welcome to Headmaster's Book Club. I'm Josiah Batten, headmaster of Emmanuel Christian School in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Today we're talking about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. The Wizard of Oz is one of the most iconic stories in American history because of the 1930s film, The Wizard of Oz, or The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It's so culturally significant that references to it are considered essential to cultural literacy in the United States. You might hear a reference, for example, to flying monkeys, which is, of course, a reference to The Wizard of Oz. Now, there are a lot of theories about The Wizard of Oz, and many people try to read the story through the lens of feminism or through the lens of a sort of political understanding of the story, some type of parable about the gold standard or something like that. I'm inclined to not take those approaches. In fact, in virtually any reading, I try not to take those types of reader response approaches. Baum actually gave us in his introduction his motive for writing this story. And I think it's best if we consider what he wanted to do with the story from the author himself. In the introduction to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Baum writes, "Folklore, legends, myths, and fairy tales have followed childhood through the ages, for every healthy youngster has a wholesome and instinctive love for stories fantastic, marvelous, and manifestly unreal. The winged fairies of Grimm and Andersen have brought more happiness to childish hearts than all other human creations. Yet the old-time fairy tale, having served for generations, may now be classed as historical in the children's library, for the time has come for a series of newer wonder tales, in which the stereotyped genie, dwarf, and fairy are eliminated, together with all the horrible and blood-curdling incidents devised by their authors to point a fearsome moral to each tale. Modern education includes morality, therefore the modern child seeks only entertainment in its wonder tales and gladly dispenses with all disagreeable incident." Having this thought in mind, the story of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written solely to please children of today. It aspires to being a modernized fairy tale in which the wonderment and joy are retained and the heartaches and nightmares are left out. Baum wrote that in April of 1900, 123 years ago. Now, there's a lot in that introduction. First, it's very clear that Baum wants to write a sort of modernized fairy tale. He intends The Wizard of Oz to be a fairy story, and I think by most definitions of that term, you could say it is a fairy story, even looking at the things that Tolkien would have used to define a fairy story. It is a story that has magic. It is a story that has sorts of magical beings. Now, yes, he does not have elves in Oz, but he invents other sorts of species and beings to populate his world. One of the most memorable of which I think all of us would recognize, the Munchkins, right? So it is, in a sense, a fairy story. But I think there are some dangers that motivated Baum here as well. One of his points is he wants to get rid of all the horrible and blood-curdling incidents. Now, don't get me wrong, there were things in Grimm fairy tales, Andersen's fairy tales, that could be considered probably too advanced, too dark for very young audiences. And I'm not opposed to limiting those things. I do think Baum makes a mistake in his attempt to, A, disconnect his story from morality, to say that this is entertainment only. Well, that's simply not true. No story is mere entertainment. And in fact, the effort to make a story entertainment, mere entertainment, is itself a moral position, is itself a moral stand. a moral stance. It's unavoidable to take a moral position in telling a story. And I think it was actually a bad thing that Baum was motivated to try to do that. It probably reflects the, uh, how should I say it, values and assumptions of his own day. In excuse me, writing as he did in the excuse me, writing as he did in the early 1900s or late 1800s in this case. Now, with that said, I also think it's important to recognize that a little bit of the nightmare, a little bit of the danger, the darkness has to be retained for a good fairy story. And Baum doesn't completely eliminate those things, right? He obviously does have villains. He has the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wicked Witch of the East, and they are, in their very name, wicked and evil. With all of that said, what Baum does give us, the positive contribution he makes, is an American fairy tale. The fairy tales that we know and love are often very much centered in Europe, or in some cases in other classical societies, such as we might, to some extent, say that some of Aesop's fables are some of them are fairy tales. And they're often centered in places in Europe, ancient Greece, Rome, right? We have a lot of myths, a lot of stories that come from other countries. The United States was only 124 years old at the time that Baum was publishing The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. He was born in 1856. He's born just 30-ish years after founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams passed away. He grew up in his childhood through the American Civil War, right? He would have been about 8, 9 years old by the time the American Civil War ends. And he would have lived through, not at the time of writing, but he eventually would live through World War I. He would see the end of World War I. So he's a man who lived through in his childhood the American Civil War and also lived to see the end of World War I, one of perhaps the first very modern war. And he recognizes the need for this Americanized fairy tale. Yes, we have King Arthur. Yes, we have these other stories. We have these sort of European fairy stories. But what about a uniquely American fairy story? And interestingly, at the same time, we're going through this period where America also gets one of its great cultural sort of myths, and that is the advent of cowboys, right? If you were to compare knights to some American version of that, well, the American version of a knight is a cowboy, is a John Wayne type character, right? And a lot of those Westerns originated in literature, of course, before they were movies. And that's exactly what we see here with Baum, this attempt at an American fairy story, where you have a girl from Kansas, and I assume most of you are familiar with this part of the story at least. You have a girl from Kansas, and she's caught up in a tornado, in a twister. And she's then transported to this magical world and has to then navigate her way home. This is a very uniquely American type of story. And it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is still a fairy story. I think Baum made a mistake trying to disconnect his story from morality. This idea that morality occurs in education, so stories can just be entertainment, I think is absurd. If you want to teach kids what is good and you want to teach them to love the good, then you should teach the good in a way that captures their attention and that attracts them and that is beautiful and desirable, right? And so I think an effort to try to divorce those is absolutely absurd. With that said, he still makes a significant contribution in giving us an American fairy story. So I hope you will read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. You don't even have to buy it. You can find the full text on Project Gutenberg. You can also listen to it if you prefer. Just look on YouTube and search The Wonderful Wizard of Oz audiobook. Right here on my screen, I see at least 2 full readings of it. One goes for 4 hours and 6 minutes. The other goes for 3 hours and 45 minutes. So, and even if you wanted to take this and read it to your children as a bedtime story, 20 minutes a night, and you could have the entire book read in about 12 or so days. So that is our introduction to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It is an American fairy story. And our last book was not a novel, was not a fiction book, right? We started off with a book by Owen Anderson on the beginning of philosophy. This is going to be very different, as you might imagine. And one of the things we have to recognize about novels and fairy stories is it's not just about the adventure that Dorothy goes on. It's about the adventure that you go on. As you enter into the world of Oz, as you step into this fictional world, even as you step into a real world, right? Kansas is a real place. As you step into that real world that existed at a time we no longer live in, 123 years ago, right? There's almost as much time between us and the writing of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz as there is between the writing of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and the Declaration of Independence. So keep that in mind. We are entering a different time and to some extent a different place. And it's not just about the adventure that Dorothy goes on. It's about the adventure that we go on as we read the book and as we enter the wonderful land of Oz. So I hope you'll join us. I hope you've enjoyed this little video. And make sure to follow along on my blog, emmanueleagles.com/blog. Over the months of November and December, I will be putting out some more Wizard of Oz related content on my blog in written form. So read along, enjoy your adventures in Oz.